The other day in constitutional law, I just taught Eakin versus Rao, a case in which Chief Justice John Bannister Gibson of Pennsylvania criticized Marshall's argument in Marbury versus Madison. The two men had met years earlier, it turns out, when Gibson was a young man and was uncertain about whether to accept a position on the bench. He went to ask for Marshall's advice, and trying to butter him up, he began, "Mr. Chief Justice, you have reached the acme of judicial distinction." Marshall interrupted him right there and said, "Let me tell you what that means, young man. The acme of judicial distinction means the ability to look a lawyer straight in the eye for 2 hours and not hear a damn word he says." Well, I hope tonight you can look me in the eye for 30 minutes or so and hear an occasional word or two. My talk tonight will be in 4 parts. The Constitution, large C, and the Constitution, small c. 2, the cultural preconditions of American constitutionalism. 3, how to ensure those preconditions and the limits on federalism. And 4, what is to be done. So let me turn to part 1. We're here tonight to celebrate the United States Constitution, large C. And this is fitting, for there's a good deal of truth in English Prime Minister William Gladstone's encomium that, quote, "The American Constitution is, so far as I can see, the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man," unquote. But tonight, I want to praise not only the American Constitution, large C, but the American Constitution, small c. At one point, Aristotle defines a constitution or regime as an arrangement of a polis with respect to its offices, particularly the one that has authority over all. Earlier, he had given a somewhat broader definition, a certain arrangement of those who inhabit the city. But finally, he gives a very broad definition, the arrangement in the polis connected with the offices, establishing the manner in which they have been distributed, what the authoritative element of the regime is, and what the end of the partnership is in each case. Now, when we hear this, what should strike us first about the American Constitution, large C, is how limited it is. There's a brief indication of the purposes of government in the preamble. It certainly talks about some offices and the selection of those a bit. But if you think about it, the American Constitution, large C, is only a small part of the American Constitution, small c. It established a new central government and assigned it some important but limited powers, especially war, foreign affairs, and foreign and interstate commerce. But there's much more to our government. The Constitution, in the first place, presumes the existence of states and their broad powers. As Madison points out in The Federalist, which some of you may have read from time to time, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external objects as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which last the power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. And as Hamilton says in Federalist number 17, there is one transcendent advantage belonging to the province of state governments, which alone suffices to place the matter in a clear and satisfactory light. I mean the ordinary administration of criminal and civil justice. This of all things is the most powerful, most universal, and most attractive source of popular obedience and attachment. It is that which, being the immediate and visible guardian of life and property, having its benefits and its terrors in constant activity before the public eye, regulating all those personal interests and familiar concerns to which the sensibility of individuals is more immediately awake, contributes more than any other circumstance to impressing upon the mind of the people affection, esteem, and reverence toward the government. Now, how limited federal powers were may be suggested by the fact that for 3/4 of a century after 1789, the most common point of contact between American citizens and U.S. government was the mailman. So, the Constitution of the U.S., small c, it turns out, is much broader than the American Constitution, large C. Part 2. What I want to focus on this evening, however, is not primarily government offices and powers. I want to look at another aspect of how America was constituted, namely its social and cultural mores. For this, we tend to shift from the Federalist to Tocqueville. These will generally not be found in the Constitution, large C, but they were an extraordinarily important part of the Constitution, small c. In fact, I would call them the foundation of American constitutionalism, or even the cultural preconditions of American constitutionalism. Let me give a brief run-through of 6 of them tonight. 1, a realist epistemology. 2, capacity for joint deliberation and action. 3, a spirit of independence and self-reliance. 4, sexual morality. 5, moderation of the taste for physical well-being. And 6, a certain kind of religion. So first, a realist epistemology, or faith in man's capacity to know the truth. There are some people who think, many these days, who think that the best ground for protecting liberty is a fundamental skepticism about whether it is possible to know ultimate truths. Such skepticism, they think, undermines ideology and diminishes the likelihood that people will feel so sure of their beliefs that they will try to impose them on others. This is Justice Holmes's view in his famous words on free speech in Abrams versus U.S. in 1919. The problem with this approach is that it is difficult to prevent such broad skepticism from being applied to the principles of freedom themselves. The American founders were epistemological realists. They understood the need to have a solid foundation for Republican government in principles confidently held to be true, like the self-evident principles of the Declaration of Independence, in order to avoid placing society on the shifting and unstable grounds of relativism or skepticism. An important corollary to the belief that men can know truth is confidence that it's really possible to interpret documents, such as the Constitution. Contrary to fashionable contemporary hermeneutical theories, the founders thought that it was possible to interpret written documents without the interpreter necessarily reading his own views into it, though that was constantly a danger to be avoided, of course. Without this confidence, the very act of writing a constitution would have been an act of blind faith. 2, the capacity for joint deliberate action, civil and political associations. Americans take for granted many of their own capacities. It is simply part of our ordinary experience, for example, that people organize voluntary associations to accomplish a multitude of purposes, and that they deliberate about matters of common concern, both within those civil associations and within their political institutions, from school boards and town councils up through Congress. That is not true of all societies, especially those with rigid hierarchies and those ruled strictly by custom. Even something as simple as organizing and running a committee meeting is beyond the experience of people in many cultures. Tocqueville pointed out that Americans have a real genius for voluntary association, as well as political association. The sources of this capacity vary, including the need for pioneer communities to work together to survive under harsh physical circumstances. Also the congregational character of early American religious communities, and the default position of local governance when the home country was so far away. And its consequences are enormous in a society based on equality of conditions, since it makes possible effective action by non-governmental associations, and it promotes decentralization within government itself, and is thereby an invaluable bulwark against despotism. 3, a spirit of independence and self-reliance. The protection of liberty requires that a citizenry have a deep attachment to liberty, especially in the face of temptations to trade it for other apparent goods. Tocqueville presciently noted that the potential conflict between liberty and equality, when the latter is understood as equality of condition, and he worried especially about the tendency of democratic citizens to value equality over liberty. A mild democratic despotism, he thought, might be willing and able to take on the responsibility of providing people with social equality and material well-being in exchange for their giving up to a vast provident bureaucracy, political freedom, and control over their lives. And a democratic citizenry excessively attached to equality over liberty might accept the offer. Our cultural emphasis on freedom and independence helps to explain some of the differences between European democracies and the US. For one, European nations, even after the overthrow of the Ancien regime in the French Revolution, never completely eliminated the old culture of deference to the higher orders, which still lingers on palpably with respect to the European Union elites. Americans never lived in a feudal society, having experienced substantial social equality from their very beginnings. Even the very attenuated deference to American leaders in the first few decades was gone with the Jacksonian Democratic Revolution. Moreover, the substance of democracy in the US has involved direct political activity by ordinary people at various levels of government, not simply the once every few years choice between political parties that European parliamentary democracies offer. Another difference between Europeans and Americans is that Americans are less likely to confuse the responsibility of government to promote the common good by fostering conditions in which citizens can support themselves and their families with the supposed responsibility of government to provide that support itself. 4. Sexual morality, family supportive customs and mores. A stable family unit is the foundation of society. Taming the powerful sexual passions and channeling them is essential for the formation of the families that will raise the next generation of citizens and shape their character in support of free constitutional government, liberty under law. Tocqueville notes that travelers to America all agree that morals are more strict here than elsewhere, and that the conjugal tie is very strict. Laws regarding sexual morality, though their earlier harshness required attenuation, were examples of Tocqueville's observation that Americans combine the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty admirably. For a fixed moral world is necessary to provide a framework for the flux of political freedom. The family is the first small community in which children learn about responsibilities and rights, getting along with others, and the requirements of contributing to the common good. Moreover, as Jennifer Roback Morse has argued, failed families contribute in a multitude of ways to the pressure for expanding government power, as our experience with the decline of family stability and the rise of the modern welfare state suggests. 5, moderation in the pursuit of material well-being. Tocqueville, a student of the great French political philosopher Montesquieu, knew of the danger that a spirit of commerce, in which men work diligently to produce more wealth, could easily give way to a spirit of luxury, in which men were more focused on the consumption of wealth than its production. An excessive care for worldly welfare, what today we call consumerism, would likely end up impairing that very welfare. Yuval Levin observes that the case for capitalism requires an understanding of the need for prudence, restraint, industry, frugality, sobriety, honesty, civility, and reliability. In a word, discipline. Moreover, Tocqueville argues that absorption in the pursuit of material well-being would likely render men insensitive both to the importance of political life, to defend their freedom, and to, quote, those more precious possessions which constitute the glory and the greatness of mankind, close quote, by which he meant especially the arts, knowledge, and learning, confronting the perennial questions of human life. The strong inclination of democratic citizens to pursue well-being had to be kept moderate in its goals, greater prosperity in small steps, not great leaps, and prevented from dominating life. Note, with respect to these last 2 points, that sexual morality and moderation in the taste for physical well-being both relate to temperance, resisting the morally distorting effects of pleasure, which is a necessary condition for fortitude, resisting the morally distorting effects of pain. And Aristotle's paradigmatic case of fortitude is the willingness of citizens to defend their country, which entails the possibility of making the ultimate sacrifice of dying in battle. No nation whose people are unwilling to risk this sacrifice when necessary can survive indefinitely in the world as we know it. Lord Patrick Devlin once put the issue this way: a nation of debauchees would not in 1940 have responded satisfactorily to Winston Churchill's call to blood and toil and sweat and tears. 6. A certain form of religion. Tocqueville argued that religion is among the first of American political institutions. Why? Because religion, in the form it took in early American history, supported the necessary moral framework for the political world, and it mitigated some of the dangerous tendencies of democracy, such as individualism and materialism. Tocqueville's arguments refer not to religion generically, but to a certain kind of religion, such as the Christianity of Americans. What Tocqueville says of the Christianity of early America, largely Protestant, but this was a time when Christians generally shared the same views of morality, would not be said of a theocracy on one hand, or of a purely civil religion on the other. Democracy benefited from religion that on one hand moderated democratic tendencies rather than attacking them head on, and that refused on the other to accommodate them fully. Religion is the safeguard of morality, and morality is the surest pledge of the duration of freedom. In this, Tocqueville was simply repeating the famous advice of Washington in his farewell address. Part 3, how to ensure the essential cultural preconditions of liberty. One of the great questions about American constitutionalism is, how are these preconditions to be assured? This question takes on a greater urgency as we see cultural changes all around us that may seriously endanger them. In this regard, there are some healthy inclinations and some dangerous temptations in current political ideologies. Some people, such as economic conservatives and libertarians, incline toward the view that the cultural preconditions are best fostered by non-governmental institutions, by civil society. At the same time, they can be tempted to think that they can only be fostered by civil society. Other people, such as social and cultural conservatives, incline toward the view that government must take an active role in promoting or fostering these varied preconditions. At the same time, they can be tempted to think that government must take a leading role. I think that both sides are right in their moderate forms, that is, in their inclinations, but not in their temptations. Government can hardly create these preconditions itself out of whole cloth, but nor is it irrelevant to their sustenance. Government has a role, but a limited one. As Tocqueville noted, there's a reciprocal relation between laws and mores, both of which are essential, but of the two, the mores are more fundamental. Now, one question I want to raise is whether federalism is the answer today. In the founding, most of the cultural preconditions fell within the area of state control. So, unsurprisingly, one of the changes that endanger the cultural preconditions of the Constitution is the decline of the original constitutional form of federalism. The framers established a limited federal government whose primary responsibilities were the conduct of war and foreign affairs and the establishment of a framework for a national economy. No one dreamed of entrusting fundamental social issues such as education or marriage, family and sexual morality, or religion to the federal government, since those were firmly left in the hands of the state. There was little to worry about in any case, since there was hardly any controversy about such issues at the time, due to the consensus on the ability of reason to know fundamental truths, and on the family and sexual morality that flowed from Americans' widely shared Christian beliefs. Thus, the founders could more or less take for granted social mores reflected in and supported by state laws that would support belief in fundamental truths and channel sexual activity in directions that reinforce the family and accommodate varied religious beliefs. There was no need even to think about such matters at a national constitutional convention. Of course, what the framers could assume has since been blown away. Since the 1960s in particular, social mores have changed substantially, peeled away by a combination of affluence and disaffected intellectual elites with the aggressive support of media and judges committed to an agenda of greater sexual autonomy and dismissive of popular doubts or opposition. The mores regarding truth and family, marriage, and sex that the founders took for granted are now greatly weakened, and even their vestiges are under attack in our culture wars throughout our universities and media and entertainment and popular culture. Now, in addition to the simple fact that the Supreme Court has nationalized these issues, there are other factors that make it impossible to rely on federalism today as the answer. Despite some conservatives' hopes, it is now doubtful that any state, if so inclined, could protect a subculture of traditional mores. The fact is that contemporary culture is shaped much more by broad national and even cross-national forces than by any local or regional ones. Unless it were possible for a state to erect virtual walls at its borders to keep out television and Hollywood movies and internet pornography and most of the New York Times bestseller list, the reliance on federalism to sustain traditional mores is misplaced. The culture war today is like the Civil War in this respect. Just as we could not indefinitely remain half slave and half free, so we will not be able to remain indefinitely half red state and half blue state. And culturally, the blue state forces are clearly winning today. Part 4, what is to be done? So what is to be done in the midst of an ongoing culture war in the United States? It is true that many more Americans than is commonly recognized are purple rather than red or blue. They want limits on abortion, but only at certain times or in certain ways. They want to treat homosexuals fairly, but they don't want gay marriage. They want school prayer and an inclusive civil religion, but they are nervous about too much public religion or sectarian religion, and so on. These preferences may not always be particularly coherent, but they represent the existing framework of our political life. At the same time, there are sizable groups of deeply red and blue partisans at either end of the cultural spectrum. Some cultural conservatives seem to believe that laws or social compulsion can resolve social problems by compelling obedience to moral norms. And some economic conservatives seem to believe that government has little or no role to play in resolving social problems. Some cultural liberals seem to believe that human beings do not need a moral framework to prosper. And others seem to believe that the invisible hand about which they have such doubt in economic matters will provide whatever minimal moral framework is necessary for our society. In this context, the best option, as far as public policy goes, would be what I call a moderate moralism, which recognizes the importance of cultural norms in the preservation of healthy liberal constitutionalism and a role for law in supporting them, but that also recognizes the sharp limits on what law or government can do. So, for example, with respect to abortion, we should continue incremental efforts to protect more human lives, which also promotes public discussion of the issue, while understanding that broader cultural change is necessary for more comprehensive solutions. Regarding the family, there may be benefits in public programs to encourage counseling before young people get married, in laws that provide space for sober second thoughts before no-fault divorce deprives children of a home with two parents, and in resistance to gay marriage. But it is voluntary associations and not government that will have to take the lead in restoring a marriage-supportive culture. Regarding religion, government should recognize the wisdom in first do no harm, It can refrain from actively undermining religion by promoting extreme conceptions of the separation of church and state, and refrain from invading more areas of social life, the vast array of modern education and social welfare legislation, and pushing religion out as it enters those areas. But we should certainly not look to public policy to revive religion. Going beyond public policy, most importantly, we need to devote our attention to the preservation of the American Constitution, small c, that undergirds the American Constitution, large C, and without which it cannot survive. One of the awkward truths about liberal democracy is that for all the genuine importance of laws as a form of moral education, its cultural preconditions are likely to depend on forces largely beyond politics. In particular, I think that the most important force sustaining the cultural preconditions of a healthy American liberal democracy is vital religious belief that mitigates the skepticism, individualism, and materialism to which liberal democracy is vulnerable. And yet, what the government established by the American Constitution, large C, can do about this is quite limited. Most of what can be done will be done much closer to our grassroots. The founders pointed to this in a document that predates the Constitution, large C, namely in the Northwest Ordinance, which organized the territories west of the original 13 states that were part of the U.S. under the 1783 Treaty of Paris. In that ordinance, we find that, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And Tocqueville points out that most of this education involved a serious religious component. Education and faith, reason and revelation are here intertwined. What the situation of contemporary American education is might be a long topic, for another evening. For tonight, I will simply point out that the University of Dallas is an outstanding representative of what our forebears had in mind. Now, in conclusion, I have an apology to make. I hope some of you are not feeling unsettled, because with all the large C's and small C's I've been throwing at you tonight, I'm afraid that some of you may have become seasick by now. So let me end by asking that we raise our glasses and toast the American Constitution, large C, that the framers bequeathed us, and the American Constitution, small c, to which so many of our forebears contributed and of which we are the beneficiaries, and pledge that we in our own day will take up the noble task of sustaining both of those constitutions.